thank you, everybody. Christine Williams, I know I've just briefly met a few people. I had the opportunity to meet a few people when I was at Brooklyn College a few weeks ago. I run the Northeast region for Aon, and I'm based here in New York, born and bred in Queens, New York. So love to see the partnership that we have with Brooklyn. I shared this a few weeks ago. My mother is a graduate of Brooklyn College, so very proud to be in this partnership. We greatly appreciate it. I've had the opportunity to spend some time with some of my colleagues at a recent visit with Dr. Miles Bassel, Coach B, if I may, and some of his students at the Koppelman School of Business. It was a great night. It went on and on, right? Like we had a great session, and then we had so many great conversations and questions. So happily we'll do that again, right? It was really a great night.
What are you doing next Tuesday?
Somehow you're going to talk me into being there, so I'm game. I've been at Aon for 22 years. During this time, I've seen the power of disruption, the good and the bad. I've learned from disruption, right? Being proactive, strategic, optimistic sometimes when it's tough can turn things from, being more uncertain or grim to opportunities. The only constant is change. I actually said that to somebody today as they were walking out the door. They were leaving us, right? And how you react to that change, right? When you lose a good colleague or you leave a role or whatever it is. So your ability to adapt to change will determine your success in life. And I know you have some wonderful conversations that you're going to talk about tonight. So I am very pleased to welcome President Michelle Anderson and my colleague and friend, Aaron Olson. The discussion tonight's going to focus on leadership during disruption and the role of industry academic partnerships in shaping future-ready careers and organizations. I wish I had this lecture probably 25 years ago, so it's going to be amazing. They're going to talk about the topics from Aaron's book on strategy and change and finding opportunity in disruption through insight, choice, and risk. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to President Anderson.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see people here gather together to talk about this terrific new book. I hope you can all read it. I highly recommend it. I want to thank Christine Williams for graciously hosting this evening and this important conversation, and also for Aon's ongoing support of Brooklyn College, the institution, and our students. Aon's commitment as a company to education and to fostering opportunities for students is really inspiring. Few companies have this level of dedication. It's devotion, really. And we're grateful for the work Aon has engaged in that led to a very strong partnership with Brooklyn College. Heartfelt thanks specifically to Aaron Olson, who is fantastic. He's an executive vice president here at Aon. He's also a professor at Northwestern, where he teaches strategy and leadership, so we can all, including me, we can all learn from him. The partnership between Aon and Brooklyn College would not have happened but for his personal, profound commitment to our students and also more broadly to changing the world for the better. Today, I'm thrilled to have a conversation with Aaron about his new book, Strategy and Change, Finding Opportunities in Disruption Through Insight, Choice, and Risk, a topic that's especially relevant in today's world. I want to thank you, Aaron, for writing this book. I learned a lot from it as a leader, and I recommend it to everyone here. So I'll just jump in with some questions. How do you define disruption, and are we seeing more of it today?
Well, thanks, Michelle. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to turn this first question into a chance to say something beyond just answering that question for a second, because I don't want to miss a chance to thank you. Because a partnership comes, from really collaboration both ways. You and I have had that good experience, but actually there's many people in the room who've been a part of that on both the Aon side and the Brooklyn College side. And frankly, as we get into some of this, that's kind of the point. I think that relationships are the basis of getting things done and making change happen. And we've been lucky, as Christine nicely described, to have both sort of reasons that we care about together, relationships that then make that happen. And thankfully, at this point, I think we can talk about some of the good things that have come out of it. So to your question on disruption, Let me first talk about like a little bit of where this book came from, because it explains a bit about why we did it and then what we learned. So I don't know that I ever thought, okay, one of my big goals in life is going to be write a book. Actually, I can tell you that wasn't. But I had the good fortune, as you mentioned, to work with some wonderful people, starting at Northwestern University while I was still here at Aon, over the course of, frankly, now 20 years, where I've been in a variety of roles here at Aon, but also been able to spend some time in the classroom. In Northwestern with a gentleman, 𝘊𝘵𝘬𝘁𝘓, who also is a faculty member there. And so we started some work on the topic of strategy and leadership. And after doing that for a couple of years, we actually wrote one book on that topic. That was 10 years ago. And so we were really pleased when the publisher Wiley came back to us and said, hey, that was interesting and great, and would you like to do a follow-up?
A lot has changed in the last 10 years.
A lot changed in the last 10 years. And so it was very natural to say, well, what's really worth focusing on 10 years later? Disruption and change is what's worth focusing on. So we did it because it was really relevant. Now it's relevant to our business too. At Aon, we focus on risk and people issues for organizations, and the people in the organizations and all of us are dealing with this. So we really focused on disruption because it matters a lot.
Yeah.
We thought there were some best practices, but we also thought the world is different now. It is, I think, true and fair to say that we see change come faster, and we see disruption, happen at a different pace and in a different way. And I think the most practical things to say about that, just to be specific, are if you go back and you look at what's happened, not just over the last 10 years, but if you go back a couple decades, the pace with which things happen is unequivocally faster in areas where technology makes that happen. It took 5 years for Netflix to get to 1 million different users. It took 5 days for ChatGPT to get to that many people. So that just illustrates the point. The other thing that we really were able to find in looking at this is, in any given day, an individual like any of us doing our work, or the CEO of an organization might have been facing on one big disruption. Now it's, how many do you feel like you're dealing with as a leader of Brooklyn College?
10 easy.
One would be a luxury, right? And so the speed and then the concurrent nature of multiple things coming at all of us is just very different.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? It's obviously a function of technology and technological change, but what else is going on that makes it so rapid for us to, because for me, it's not just technological change that's happening, not just technological disruption. Why do you think it's happening overall?
Yeah. So first, I think we should be clear about what we mean by technology. I gave you 2 examples that were literally sort of technologies, but technology just accelerates other things, right? The pandemic wasn't a technology event, but it was faster than other pandemics in the way it spread because of technology, starting with transportation, right? So I think that's one of the reasons. I think the other reason is the word disruption itself, and being thoughtful about kind of what do we mean when we say disruption. It's not just something that comes along that is hard to deal with. It's something that changes fundamental things. And so we go into examples in what we wrote in terms of disruption is when the rules change, right? And look, we'll get into some real examples of here, but you don't have to think very hard to think like, okay, there are times now when things that we used to assume were consistent aren't anymore.
So one of the things early in the book, you argue that with innovation, sometimes companies actually write their own obsolescence because they cannot see additional disruption coming down the pike. And I wonder, how do companies that are innovating sow the seeds of their own demise? And what can we learn from that?
So, there are a couple of real examples that illustrate this nicely, and then there's just sort of the lessons that you can learn from those examples. So, probably through your own studies, through some of the great classes at Brooklyn College, you've come across the examples, or them just, from recent history. Look, Blockbuster was before Netflix. Why don't we have Blockbuster anymore? Well, it's a different technology, but also Blockbuster didn't make that change, right? They could have. You could imagine that they could have. Kodak is another example that we talk about, right? Kodak actually has had a bit of a resurgence as a brand, but that's not for the same reasons they used to be successful, which was the film, and so that's another good example. And why is it that digital photography was something that they couldn't figure out? The reason for those, as we look at those situations carefully, is the things that made them successful and then made them stand out end up reinforcing them not being ready or willing to change. The things that got you successful become, the basis for which then you become kind of rigid. And if you've worked in an organization, or as you're a student and you look at organizations, a lot of the things that organizations need, structure, process, being able to do things, get the product out on time or get the client what they need on time, are the very things that can sometimes become rigidity that prevents you from being flexible when things need to change. And that's a real tension. Organizations have a hard time figuring out, how do we maintain the things that that have made us good up until this point, and we can't stop doing that because that's what people want from us. But equally, this new thing is coming, and can we adapt to that, and how? And some figure that out and some don't.
So I'm old enough to remember when Blockbuster first opened, and I thought, wow, this is great. You mean you could go to a store and you could pick out a video, and then you could go home and you could play it and then bring it back. And when Netflix came along and started to send DVDs to people's homes, Blockbuster didn't particularly change on that. And then the streaming started. What do you think Blockbuster leadership is thinking at that time? What's going on there? They see different technologies coming along. What happens?
Yep. So I think it's mixed incentives, up and down an organization, and the fact that is, again, the rules and the assumptions are just very different. They had been successful because they could be the place where you could go and you could get a wide selection based on what was considered at that time. But that's not an infinite selection, right? But the convenience of being able to go down the street, frankly, at first was more convenient than, a lot of people who wouldn't have had the internet access necessarily, or if they did, it might not have performed at the level. So they needed to focus on succeeding at the customers that they currently served. Whereas Netflix wasn't burdened by that, they were able to think entirely differently, and they were basically able to put their money in things that they could allocate to that were, frankly, a very small number of customers at the time, but that they were prepared to serve. And they saw that if their assumptions which were correct, were a lot of things will kick in so that this very small group of customers will eventually become very large. Whereas Blockbuster wasn't able to make that trade-off. They couldn't figure out how to allocate resources to do that new thing while still focusing on the thing that they used to do.
I'm wondering if the example of Blockbuster, is it just flying past a lot of people, or you're following? You're following. Okay. Okay, this was before a lot of what we take for granted today existed. Yep. So you describe a time historically in which there were clear industry boundaries and single-purpose businesses. Competition was a zero-sum game, and the point of competition was to take and hold market share relative to one's rivals. That's the traditional view of the market even today. But you narrate that has changed. It doesn't always hold true, and it has evolved. Can you tell us the story of that?
Yeah. And examples will help here. Again, I might switch over and talk a bit about the sort of the film industry and how digital photography changed. But I think if you would have gone back in the time, and you would know Kodak maybe because, again, that brand still lasts, even though the things that they did at the time, like producing film for print, doesn't. There were other companies you probably haven't heard of that were doing it and that they would have focused on. Fuji was a film company. And so what was their primary focus? Being better than Fuji. Right, and that was to then fulfill the film that would be go into cameras from other companies like Canon. So that was the way that market worked. They actually had a research team focused on digital photography. So at Kodak. So it was not that they didn't see this, but what was hard for them to understand, but actually even harder for them to do anything about, was today we're not buying a digital camera. We're buying something we call a phone, right, for other historical reasons, but it's just this multi-purpose device. And so that was where just the market and the rules around it were fundamentally different. So even though they were actually a heavily investor in digital photography and frankly pioneered a lot of the underlying technologies, they ended up not being able to be the one who brought those to market because the things that they did ended up not being the market anymore. They were like, okay, film could be replaced digitally in a camera, but nobody buys those cameras, or they are now a niche, and that market still exists. But it's very hard to imagine like how could Kodak have become a BlackBerry, or of course then what really became an iPhone. And those were the things that, just the rules of the market changed, and it was very hard for them to adapt, even though they saw some of those things.
Yeah, so they had a research team seeing on the horizon this thing called digital photography. Yeah. What can we learn by the fact that they failed?
Yep.
Was it a failure? It wasn't a failure of sight on the horizon. It was a failure of imagination of what that meant in terms of how people distribute photography on social media, how people take photographs. There's just so much that has changed in terms of that. What can we learn from it?
Yeah. So I actually think that what's happened since, and you'll see more, is creativity around business models themselves, right? Because I think actually there's some interesting literature out there that says they couldn't have done anything because all the incentives were set up and the structures of the market were set up so that there's not a realistic situation where a Kodak would have found a path. And I think if you think of Kodak as a standalone company that then got obviated by other standalone companies, that's probably true. But when I say business models changes, I think now we have a much wider definition of the way businesses can work. Because there are structures like, okay, maybe we need to have partners that do this. Maybe we actually need to think about our business and our sources of revenue and our customers differently, right? So you talked about social media. What have we all learned? That actually those parts of the way photography and sort of digital imaging evolved just have a fundamentally different way of working, right? Technically for us, they're free, but they're being paid for somehow, right? So there's advertising in those things. So I think that a Kodak now, or whatever the Kodak today is that's looking at that in their own market and situation, has to just think much more widely and be creative. What does it mean for us to exist in an ecosystem? What role could we play? Does that actually happen in partnerships or some sort of structures that just we haven't done before, or might just be fundamentally different than have existed in the market?
Well, so how do we flex those muscles?
Yeah.
These are things that we haven't done before.
Yep.
These are things that we may see coming down the pike, but it's a different way of conceptualizing even business itself, as you suggest in the book. How do we flex the muscles or train the muscles to be able to be responsive to these market shifts?
Yep. And so I think this gets to what do you do about disruption, right? Yeah. And so let's just start by that's not an easy answer, right? We have examples we can look at of market winners and market losers, trying to find what are the things that they fundamentally did that set themselves up for success that can be repeated. Yeah. In some ways, it feels a little bit like finding a unique situation in every single situation, but I do think there's some fundamental things. And they get to leadership, so back to where this whole thing started with, is I think it puts a real premium on a couple of skills and capabilities. Those can be individual leadership skills, like any of us can think about how do I do this, and they're organizational skills, or I would call those capabilities. And this is where we came to 3 core capabilities: insight, choice, and risk. You have to have really dedicated focus on how do we see what's coming around the corner, how do we evaluate the choices that we have given those changes that are coming, and then how do we manage the risks that are associated with it. And those are very fundamental skills. Yeah. But they're actually also leadership skills. They're anything that I think any of us can apply when it comes to facing unique situations and disruptive changes.
So you talk about 4 different kinds of strategic leadership that need to, I want to allow you to articulate what those 4 kinds are and an example of each. And then let's talk about what are the skills among them that are responsive to these challenges that you've put forth and the skills that leaders need to have.
Yeah. And now I do have to do a little bit of the academic part here. So some of the folks in the front row are going to keep me very honest because they teach this even more than I do. But our work on leadership 10 years ago came from some research, and then we looked at it again 10 years later. So let me describe what it was 10 years ago and why then we were able to learn some things in terms of what happened. So in the field of leadership and strategy, there's a lot of great literature and a lot of great thinking out there. And we tried to look at what are the patterns across it? What is the sort of meta-analysis of the academic literature on the intersection of leadership and strategy? And it basically comes down to, there are some basic ways, if you look at the literature, to how to lead and how to set strategy. So we looked at those, and that led us to 4 different, what we called archetypes, or you can kind of think of those as styles. But it's kind of like, you need to find the right one for the right situation. So 10 years ago, we were like, okay, how do we make it more obvious to people who want to lead and want to set strategy, how to do it. And we said, well, there's 4 options, and they tend to fit different situations. So the real examples, that we talked about were kind of brought to life through classic organizations that people would be familiar with. So those 4, one at a time. We started with what we call sort of visionary leadership. And you can all think of visionary leaders. We chose to focus on Walt Disney, who founded the Disney Corporation, and how even to this day, that organization, which has evolved and changed a lot, was guided by a founding vision that Walt Disney had, started in the work that he had experience in developing animated characters and frankly, inventing the whole industry of intellectual property-based entertainment. But what is really distinctive about that story and that leadership was this vision that carried through the history of the company. And people would say after Walt Disney was no longer part of the organization, what would Walt do? And that was this sort of inspirational idea that actually led to lots of different businesses over time that look entirely different than what he started, which was animated films, but are all based on this idea of like, if you can popularize and then monetize Mickey Mouse and all these other kind of characters, you can do that. So that's visionary. Very different approach. We used General Electric, GE, actually famous for inventing a lot of what's considered management. And they wrote these blue books, that kind of codified it, and then they taught it at a place called Crotonville. They were the kind of leadership that was organizational, structure, process. They have been successful. They've been wildly successful. They were the definition of management. They were considered the CEO factory. But the way they were successful was nothing like Walt Disney. It was process and structure that made them successful. So we call that directive leadership. Not like telling people what to do, but providing structure. Then we did incubating leadership, and we chose a company that you might know, 3M. It's a science-based organization focused on innovation. What they do is almost, I think of it the opposite of a GE. They empower scientists to do original research, and then they have a really good system across it all to say, where are some of the ideas that we could actually then turn into successful products? One of the ones that you use and know very well came out of that approach called, it's Post-it notes. And Post-it notes are funny because they were considered a failure by the researcher who was like trying to come up with a really, really good adhesive, and this one was only kind of sticky. So he threw it away until this other organization, part of 3M, was trying to figure out how can we just temporarily make 2 things connect to each other? And this became this huge industry, not because of some idea that a visionary had at the top or a CEO, but because they empowered individual scientists. So we call that incubating. And then the last example we chose collaborative leadership, and we chose to use Nelson Mandela's work in the transition of apartheid, to democratic rule. And our point in picking that example was, this was an outcome that no one person could achieve alone. He had a vision too, but the fundamental issue that he had to get at was he wanted to create a societal change that he couldn't control. And we like to say, if you know GE, it's famous that was Jack Welch invented like that. And we would say, in our class, you can't Jack Welch your way to an outcome like South Africa. You can't just tell people what we're going to do and give them a process and they're going to follow your orders. You had a lot of independent people who had to make their own decisions, but they created a process which still to this day stands out as one of the notable worldwide transitions to democratic rule in a peaceful process. So these 4 examples we held up as different kinds of leadership. They worked in different situations. You couldn't necessarily take one and apply it in the other, but they all were strategic, and they were all a demonstration of leadership. And those were those 4 examples.
Visionary, innovative,
Yep.
directive, and collaborative.
Correct.
So now, which of these 4 can anticipate disruption and respond to it most effectively?
None of them. This is what we did. We then went back and we did a research analysis on what happened 10 years since then. And they all got disrupted. I'm not going to go through them all one at a time, but if you know these organizations, they aren't doing what they did 10 years ago. GE is now separate companies, which is shocking to those of us who focused on them at the time because they were the definition of a conglomerate and why it was good. And now you've seen that, I wouldn't call it fall out of fashion, it just isn't working for them anymore. Now they made some very strategic choices, but that didn't give them any extra advantage. The reason it was none of them is because they all found at some point a disruption that they had to shift gears on and change. In some ways they were able to stick to what they kept them successful, but in other ways they sometimes had to abandon principles that had, it's again, that's what got us there won't get us to the next phase. And so we actually were looking for that, and we thought it was a really meaningful conclusion to find out that none of those characteristics, they actually all can be useful still, but you know, we said there must be something else that is the fundamentals here, and frankly that, and I've kind of already said this, but that's what brought us back then to our original research and said, well, what are the other things in there? And we actually didn't even realize this at the time, but 10 years ago when we surveyed 300 leaders and we asked them, like, who do you admire and what made them successful? And we were able to kind of break down a lot of what I just described beyond these famous examples. There were 3 things underneath all of that that we found was always true. It wasn't situational. It was always important as a leader to have pattern recognition, or you can call that systems thinking. You know, to have the ability to make smart decisions and demonstrate discretion. And then this idea of like managing risk. And those things are heightened in a time of disruption because your success becomes more dependent upon them, even though they're always important.
So pattern recognition, you know, managing risk, and what's the second one?
Decision making.
Decision making.
Discretion.
Yeah, discretion. It makes me think in myself as a leader, where am I the strongest in those? And what are instances in which I've operated in different ways for each of the 3? It must make you think the same thing. And where you were deficient in certain moments. Can you share anything about that?
So can I share my shortcomings? Is that the question?
What are your weaknesses
Yeah,
as
right,
a leader?
right.
No.
I think, first of all, after having gone through this work, I probably just frankly more appreciate them and realize these 3 characteristics,
Yeah.
and realize that they're always there. Mm-hmm. Like in some ways, I think, you know, we've pointed out something that you if you thought about it enough, you'd probably come to, like, okay, yeah, pattern recognition, you know, discretion, risk. These are important parts of, you know, navigating lots of things. Yeah. But the emphasis on them, I think, is something that you then have to decide, right? You have to be aware of them, and then that self-awareness leads you to, how am I doing this, and are there ways that I could actually be more rigorous? I can think a lot of places where I think back and saying, I wish I would have been more methodical at evaluating what was really going on, because I probably could have uncovered this part that was the blind spot for me at the time. Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of ways that you can do that, but I think that blind spots are a really good example where, you know, there are ways that you can actually uncover things if you're intentional about it.
So maybe we'll shift a little bit and talk about higher education.
Yeah.
And if you have some recommendations for higher education.
Yeah, that's such a bold question. You know, you and I prepared for this one because it's very relevant given, you know, our topic here, and it's something I personally care a lot about as you've made your whole career. So first, let's set context, right? Is higher education going through disruption? Absolutely. In fact, we chose to write a case about it. We picked a couple of industries a year ago, to be honest. So to be clear, everything that we've written about, we had to come up with and finish by like last year around January 1st. So it's more true now than it was at the time, but already we knew there's a demographic cliff coming. The cost of education is an issue. That contributes to, you know, a widening and disparity, an income gap on something that historically schools are there for. Schools are actually to create opportunity. So some of this was known. Did we know that then there were going to be, you know, challenges in federal funding? No. Did we know that the, you know, concerns about the role education plays in the world? Again, you could probably see some of those things, but it's a matter of intentionality and considering, you know, potential scenarios and things. So your question is, what do you do about it? Well, that's a very hard question. But in that context, I think first, part of the title of the book I think is very relevant here is, first we have an opportunity then to figure out what we're going to do about this. And I think framing disruption as opportunity starts by creating that focus, right? So just like picking, how are we being intentional on insight, choice, and risk? There's a choice on when disruption comes, how are we going to approach it? And I think that there is real value that comes from saying, there's always a chance for improvement. There's always a chance to revisit assumptions, some of which we want to validate and hold true. Universities play a key role in society in creating opportunity for students, and that needs to be prioritized. But equally, some things might not have been revisited for a long time, and the world changes. Mm-hmm. And so I think that first an openness and willingness is good, even as we're clear on like what are the values and principles that are going to take us through this process. Then I think you have to look at the reality, right? And I think one of the things we chose to focus on in picking higher education is, and I really believe this is not just this audience, and it's not just that I'm talking to you, I don't know if there's a more challenging organization to lead of all organization types, of all industries, than universities, right? Why? They're actually, frankly, so many things, right? I mean, what schools, what other organizations run museums, sports organizations, a facility, a group of experts who have to both teach and produce original research. Are there others out there? I'm not sure I'm aware of them. And then what have more complicated inputs, right? Because you have different sources of funding, you have different kinds of expenses. Just the complexity of organizations is always a factor when it comes to either deciding strategy or execute it, because you have stakeholders, and those stakeholders all have a role to play. And importantly, in education, stakeholders have a really clear, important role to play. So how do you honor that and really build on that, even when you acknowledge, one of the things that universities weren't necessarily designed for is moving fast.
Yeah.
So, but whether you take COVID or whether you take the things going on this year, sometimes you have to move fast.
Yeah.
And so I think being real about the situation and then what are we going to do about it with those things in mind is part of figuring out the right answer.
It's so interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about how unprecedented many of the challenges that we face in higher education are of late. We haven't seen anything like this before. And a set of assumptions that you might have about how we operate vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis other stakeholders, are just fundamentally transformed of late. And that it's happening very rapidly, I think is a real challenge. Can you talk a little bit more about stakeholders and their voices within? Because I found that really interesting in terms of higher ed.
Yeah. So first of all, let me say, we chose a couple of industries and a couple of examples in the book because they were instructive. So while we'll talk about it in terms of the context of the question, like what does it mean to manage stakeholders in higher education, I'll tell you, that's a big part of the work I've done here at Aon over the years. So let me just make a comparison, and there's a bunch of people in the room here that are Aon folks, so you'll know what I'm talking about here is, we have something we've focused on for more than a decade called Aon United, and it's about how do we all work together. Well, why did we actually choose to focus on that? Why did we need to focus on that? Well, the backstory is we haven't always been one, and haven't always been together. Aon came together through 600 companies that we bought. So whether it's 600 companies that we bought or all the stakeholders that I'm sure you manage on any given day, any organization has stakeholders, right? And complexity of them is a factor. And again, I think it's good to look at some of the most challenging ones because they're instructive. When it comes to what strikes me about higher education is the stakeholders play very unique roles, but then they also bring very unique values and criteria. And the challenge is trying to come up with actions that need to be cross-cutting across lots of different groups when all those groups don't actually have the same role, necessarily have the same priorities, or even, frankly, sometimes even have the same information. And so how do you do to honor that, but also be practical about that and frankly acknowledge that? So faculty, frankly, have a key role in the institution. They are the place where the student relationship and the student outcome happens, right? And then you have alumni and you have donors. You have the students, you have the staff, you have any number of organizations around universities, of course. And I just think the key point is, how do we find something that we need to do? How do we actually articulate that? And how do we factor in all of these stakeholders in the end so both they participate in whatever the right way that they need to, but in the end play a role that they need to? Because in the end the organization has outcomes it needs to achieve. And in the end there's choices that have to be made, and those choices can't fulfill everything.
Yeah, it's really an interesting set of questions that you've talked about. One of the things that higher education really needs to do is to develop relationships with industry and become more responsive. And this is a challenging thing given the stakeholders in higher ed. But Can you talk a little bit about relationships between industry and higher education and how we've tried to navigate that and how you've navigated it with other colleges?
Yeah, and I think this will get a bit to then with all those stakeholders, what are some of the ways that you can actually find paths that actually get us through these challenging disruptive times and get us to the right outcomes? And I think, so first of all, this is the basis of actually the relationship that Brooklyn College and Aon has. So I don't want to be shy about the fact that I think we've done some things that actually have worked, and I think we'd love to see done more. And that can be other schools, that can be other companies. And I think that we both sit here wanting to be an advocate for things that we think make a difference. But what do we mean by make a difference? And this gets a bit to purpose, which I think is a big part of the answer and why I think employers and educators can actually come together. Again, there's many purposes that higher education serves, but one of them has to be, in the end, success of the student, and that has to be elevated such that it gets the attention and the resources that it needs, even when there's other things, original research, et cetera, that are also purposes of the institution. And I think one of the risks and opportunities in all these disruptive times is how do we make sure that that gets prioritized and frankly reimagined, right? Because there's a lot of things that are changing in society and in the world of work that employers are dealing with, and schools are preparing, the future workforce. What we, I think, have come to realize is you can find something that unifies people around in that, and it's the student success in the end, right? But I think that we have to be really clear about what success means, because that in some ways is not new, not different, but the world is very new and different in many different ways that we've talked about. So how do we refocus on student success? And I think we can now probably use AI as one of those good examples, right? Because it's so much in the headlines and it's all of our minds, and it's what's the world of work going to look like? What is the future of work that a lot of people in this room are preparing for? And these headlines, jobs aren't going to exist anymore. Or there's other headlines saying all this money on AI is not actually working. so you get these mixed messages, right? And we're all trying to figure out what to do. But I actually think that student success and a particular kind of student success can rise above that. And I think employers can play a unique role bringing a perspective, because we're working on this at Aon, we're working on this with our clients. The jobs are changing. And providing some of that perspective, but actually providing that through engagement. And I'm going to use Christine, who came to the classroom just a couple of weeks ago. And getting in the classroom to provide that insight to support the curriculum led by the faculty is a really practical thing that needs to happen right now. I like to say, to our employers, it is not a good thing to give this work to your recruiting team and assume that it gets worked out that way. And that's not to say the recruiting team at Aon and at every place else doesn't do an important thing, but we need to be having direct, real dialogue, honestly, around some of these issues and how they're going to work. And I think we've been really thrilled that that's a dialogue that Brooklyn College has wanted to have, and that we've got leaders and colleagues here that want to have it as well. And so we're getting in there, we're doing it. But why? Because we're focusing on this overall outcome, which is student success. And I actually think we're learning a lot about what that means and how it means. I think one of the things I would say is student success means employers knowing to look at a school that has a track record of being able to produce students that are qualified, and frankly, most importantly, without it a huge amount of crazy student debt, right? And student debt is real. Everybody has to figure out how to deal with that. But one of the things we can do is prioritize the schools that focus on figuring that out. And I think that there are schools that are distinct, like Brooklyn College, who have a proven track record of offering, reasonable tuition and a compelling, degree for somebody that's prepared to come and work. And we're out there advocating to employers, focus on that. Don't just go to the big name schools with the, crazy to say, increasingly 6-figure tuition bills at the end. Actually you can set expectations on where you see talent, where you go for talent, and then where students see that they can go to school and get real jobs, by committing to schools that have real track records on what we call economic mobility, the ability to, admit students who are well qualified, take them through the education, prepare them, and then they're ready to work, and they come out with also, a reasonable situation because they went to a school that offers that at a reasonable tuition.
Yeah, we're very proud at Brooklyn College that we have a profound commitment to economic mobility and that we're successful at it. And we're ranked at the top in the country for the economic mobility that we provide to our students. And that means an ROI, a return on investment that's very high. I can't help myself. I'm going to build on that point on ROI and the point on economic mobility. I have become a convert of economic mobility. I go out and talk to other business leaders about it and say, hey, you know what? For 7 years, I think it's 7 or 8 years, U.S. News & World Report has put out a specific ranking that ranks schools by economic mobility. Brooklyn College has always been highly ranked on that. The Wall Street Journal adopted economic mobility last year, and they just came out with it again. So for 2 years in a row, big validation that the United States' big business publication is now focusing on it. But here's the thing. Business people don't know what that term even means. Yeah. And frankly, it sounds kind of academic. So what I say is, you can look at the schools like Brooklyn College that are highly ranked in economic mobility. You should then ask your teams, are we spending time focusing on these schools because they have a track record of producing qualified students? They don't understand economic mobility, but they do understand ROI. Yeah. And so I've started to actually say, you know what, we focus on ROI all the time. This is just about student ROI. And so I don't actually care if it's economic mobility or student ROI, but I think we can actually appeal to organizations, businesses that understand ROI and understand that this is a part of ROI when it comes to the education system that really matters. Yeah. There's so much we could continue to talk about. I want to get a few student questions in here because a couple of them were sent our way. Let me see if I can find a couple. We kind of covered that question. Looking back, this is from 𝘍𝘪𝘯𝘕, Public Accounting and Business Management 2025. 𝘍𝘪, are you here? Okay, 𝘍𝘪 couldn't make it, but her question could. Here we go. Looking back, what skills and habits would you suggest early professionals like 𝘍𝘪 develop early on as they're going through college and ready to graduate?
Yeah. I think, something I've appreciated more as I've gone on is investing in relationship skills. And I think this gets back to the importance of being in the classroom side by side that I was referring to. Relationships are a big predictor of success. And I think if I would have focused on that and understood that early more, I probably would have done some things that I frankly probably wasn't real comfortable with. Even today, I probably don't always naturally do them, but I've come to realize how important it is to prioritize it. So you're all here, right? So I actually guess you're on the right track in that. And I can tell you, that, building relationships, at this point in your life through things like this and other things you do that can also be, internships, those things, make a huge difference because you create opportunity for yourself. And guess what? There will be people out there looking to create opportunity for you too because they will see it. I watch for folks who demonstrate that they're proactive, who go out of their way. I was flying here from Chicago, and the guy that sat next to me, who was 2 years out of college, he didn't have to strike up a conversation with me, but he did. And we eventually got to, well, what do I do? And now, we're connected on LinkedIn. And so he's doing that probably throughout his day and throughout his week. And, he doesn't know when that's going to pay off, but I guarantee it will. So I actually think I would put that one priority to all of you is, put the time, effort into it. First, it's with intent, but then it is a skill. And it feels awkward to begin with, but you get better with it in part through practice.
Yeah, that reminds me of the research around emotional intelligence and how critically important that is in terms of predicting success of someone in the long term. Particularly when you go to college and you're in any number of industries that have a high IQ bar to get in. It's not about your IQ. It's actually about how you develop relationships, have a sense of your own internal emotional management, and can anticipate what other people are thinking. These are all critical relationship skills. Even for people who are shy. I'm an introvert and shy, but you have to learn how to stand up and do it, and engage with people, and pretend you're not an introvert, which is what I do a lot. So Robert O'Brien, are you here? Again, Robert didn't make it, but his question did. Robert asks, what are some of the moral questions concerning the manipulation of disruption?
Yep.
Let's end on ethics, shall we?
So I do think we've talked a little bit about values, right? And in the case of higher education, in the end, values are going to provide a steer and a guide for us. And again, I think all of us in the room, would see, okay, a priority of education is the success of the student, and there's a value kind of underlying that. Now, to my surprise, there's other folks who might not, start there. But I actually think that there's ways to define these things that are broad-based, that are values-driven, and then that lend them that then encourage things that maybe I haven't talked a bit about, but get a bit into this. There's like dialogue, right? Because I actually think that we need to have dialogue, and dialogue needs to be honest and include things that we agree on and things we don't. So then let's go back to, okay, well that's probably always true, but disruption. Well, disruption puts a premium on these things. Why? Because as we talked about, disruption by definition changes things that were used to be fundamentally assumed and consistently, accurately assumed. The basic definition of disruption is the things that we were able to count on, the things that Blockbuster or Kodak were able to count on, no longer were true. So that's actually not a values thing. That was like the market environment was changing. And so you need to be able to acknowledge that, but then you bring values to how you approach that. And I actually think, putting a premium on, being curious, being open, approaching, issues with an interest in and a curiosity. These are things that also help and make a big difference. Because I think that there are certainly situations where organizations have been disrupted when they just weren't curious enough, right? And we actually go through some examples where, like, sometimes organizations even know what's going on. They just can't get those things to the right people to pay attention to them. And I think that a value of intellectual curiosity and openness and prioritizing dialogue actually they're huge predictors of organizations, and frankly, they're huge predictors of individuals too in their success. So those are certain aspects of values that I think that actually get to sort of also making a big difference when it comes to succeeding in disruption.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to hear you talk about this book. I strongly recommend it to everyone. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with you just a little bit about it tonight. And I wonder if you have any closing remarks that you want to make. So first, I'm humbled to answer all these questions, right? Because I benefit from, frankly, the things that I've learned from other people. So I'm able to share some of it here, but I want to be really clear. We even talk about this sometimes because we collaborated with a lot of people on this book. So I owe a lot of debt and a lot of credit. Some people in this room, a lot of people who aren't in this room. Maybe if I just put myself in the shoes of what a lot of us are probably trying to sort out, and a large number of folks in this room are probably early in your career and thinking about, like, how do I succeed? How do I make a difference? How do I navigate all these disruptive changes? First, I think it goes a long way to emphasize or empathize. It's not easy. Right? I have utmost respect to people who figure out complex challenges and kind of get things to happen for themselves or for others in the midst of disruptive change. And disruption can take all kinds of forms. We talked about big macro disruptions like COVID here today, but like disruption happens in all of our lives too, right? And so in the end, while this book has a lot of things about it that are about companies, and we talk about CEOs and those things, it's really a skills book, and it's really about personal things that we all deal with.
And so, I hope you take some of that from it. I apply as much of this to, frankly, like, how we're making our stuff successful at our home. I got 2 kids, one's in college and one's in high school. And I feel like I have to be strategic about working with my kids just as much as I have to be strategic about working with my colleagues and my clients. So I would just encourage you to take this as personally, and I would encourage you to connect to something you care about. Because the other thing I like in all the things that we were able to look at that were successes is they come from somebody who has a real passion for things. And you all have some passion in there, and I just hope for you to be able to find some way to use that and to apply that in a way that makes a difference for you.
That's wonderful. Why don't we give Aaron Olson a round of applause?